So starting off with a bit of a background to this Cochrane review, I'm going to do one slide on what is a Cochrane review, and then I'm going to move on and talk about sort of the content of this review, which is to do with physical rehabilitation for stroke, and then finally talk about why we felt it was important to start to have some stakeholder involvement. So my one slide on what is a Cochrane review. So a Cochrane review is a type of systematic review. A systematic review is a form of research study. And it's a research study which brings together studies that answer the same or a very similar question. And by bringing together all the studies that have addressed the same question, we can come up with an answer that we have more confidence in. So something that we can trust more. So like all research methods, a systematic review has all sorts of stages and processes that the researchers will do. So for a systematic review, that will start with writing a very detailed protocol, and then a process of searching for all the studies in the world that address their particular question and that meet certain criteria. And then a process of going through those studies and bringing out information from them, looking at the results of them, and pulling together the results of the different trials, often within a statistical analysis called a meta-analysis. And by doing all these things in a rigorous and robust way, then we can end up with an answer which is as trustworthy as it can be. Systematic reviews that are done as Cochrane reviews are done in partnership with Cochrane, have all sorts of checks on them to make sure that those methods are done to the highest possible quality. So a Cochrane systematic review is often considered to give you the highest level of evidence when it comes for looking for an answer to a question. And Cochrane reviews generally, though not always, they generally look at questions to do with how effective a treatment or an intervention is. So that's what a Cochrane review is. What was our Cochrane review about? I want to start with a little bit of history to it. So right back in 1998, there was a survey done in the UK of health professionals who were working in stroke care. And it asked those health professionals, what's your most burning question for future research? And the physiotherapists, overwhelmingly, their most burning question back in 1998 was, does bow bath therapy work? Now, bow bath therapy is a type of an approach to physiotherapy which was based on a number of different theoretical concepts. And at that time, there was a real move to think we should do the bow bath therapy or some other type of therapy. And it was a really important question to physiotherapists. So in 1999, myself and Jill and others carried out a Cochrane review that's really aimed to look at the effectiveness of these different approaches and these different named approaches to physiotherapy. So in that review, what we were keen to look at was, does physiotherapy, physical rehabilitation, is it any better than nothing or placebo or control? And then also, is one type of physiotherapy any better than another type of physiotherapy? So this was really where we were starting to want to compare these different named approaches. Now, another advantage of a Cochrane review is that it gets updated regularly, because of course new studies are published all the time and we want to keep our evidence up to date. So in 2006, we did another update of this review and we searched for new trials that had been done on this topic. Now at this point, as authors, we started to encounter a number of difficulties and challenges, because what we found is that we were finding lots of studies of physical rehabilitation for stroke, but they didn't really fit within our structure of these named approaches. And in particular, there were lots of international trials, especially from China, where there was interventions which were clearly physical rehabilitation, but they didn't fit within our named approaches that we had. So at that point in 2006, those studies weren't included, and we were aware that the review was not comprehensive of all the international evidence. So then when we planned our next update, which happened in 2013, we knew that we had to find a way of dealing with this. And we felt that rather than us as researchers sitting in our offices deciding how we should update this, that we actually wanted to reach out and speak to people who had lived experience of stroke, either as a stroke survivor or a carer or as a health professional. So we did this 2013 update involving these stakeholders. And working with these stakeholders, we came up with this new way of categorizing physiotherapy treatment components. So during the discussions with that stakeholder group back in 2013, what we realized is that physiotherapy, physical rehabilitation, it's not just one thing. It's a whole basket of fruit. There's lots of different things and components that make up physical rehabilitation. So when a physiotherapist sees a patient and they have half an hour session with them, they will be selecting all sorts of different fruits, lots of different treatment components to give that patient. So if we're comparing physiotherapy with nothing or placebo, that's quite easy. We're comparing our basket of fruit, anything that is fruit-like, with a glass of water. However, where things started to be more challenging was when we wanted to think about those comparisons of different types of physiotherapy. So really what we're starting to compare there is two different plates of fruit. So the plates might contain different types of fruit, different treatment components, but also those treatment components might be presented to the patient in a slightly different way. So what we realized working with our stakeholders that we've really had to find a way to describe the fruits, to describe the treatment components that made up physical rehabilitation. So this particular Cochrane review is about real-world physiotherapy. It's about that program of physiotherapy that a physiotherapist delivers when they go in and they spend 30 minutes, 45 minutes a day with the patient. Of course, the effectiveness of all these individual treatment components, the individual fruits, is really important. So if we imagine an apple is electrical stimulation, it's really important that we know whether electrical stimulation is an effective treatment or not. It's really important that we know whether the banana, the walking on a treadmill, is effective or not. But that's not what this review is about. Those single interventions are covered by other reviews and they're really important reviews. But what we wanted to focus on is this real world program of physiotherapy, which involved this whole selection of different fruits brought together in a particular way. So working with the stakeholders back in 2013, what they did and decided to do was to look at the descriptions of the treatments that were included in all studies that we included within the systematic review at that point. And they looked at how the researchers had described what they'd done, and they used those to pull out a number of different treatment components. And from those studies, they identified 27 different treatment components that they felt were being delivered as part of physiotherapy within those studies. And they brought them together within a number of different categories. So you can see there in green, they had a category of functional task training. So this was practice of walking, practice of standing, practice of stepping. And then in yellow, they had a whole lot of different components, which were components which are aimed at changing the musculoskeletal system in some way. So strengthening a muscle or lengthening a muscle. And then in pink, a whole lot of components which were based on neurophysiological theories. So this included some of the Bobath handling techniques. In blue then, treatments and components aimed at improving cardiopulmonary system, cardiovascular fitness. And then in orange, a whole lot of different modalities and assistive devices that might be used alongside these. So things like electrical stimulation, use of an orthotic or a walking aid. So those groups and those categories that our 2013 stakeholder group brought together were absolutely central to the Cochrane review at that point. And we used those categories and those components to describe all the studies that were included in the review and to structure our analyses and our subgroup analyses and how we presented. Absolutely central. So then when we came to start to plan our next update, this was in 2021, we were planning this, we realized that it was going to be really important to revisit this and check that this way of describing physiotherapy was still meaningful and was still relevant and was going to be able to inform clinical practice. So that is where we are now, and this is what we're going to be talking about today, how we've then gone from where we were in 2013 forward to thinking about the next phase of the review. So I am going to hand over to Jill, who's going to tell you about how we involve stakeholders. But first of all, I just want to check with Julie whether there's any questions in the chat that you want me to answer just now.
No, you're fine just now. Thanks, Alex.
Right, thank you, Julie. Right, so I'm going to hand over to Jill, who is going to move on and talk us through the stakeholder involvement.
Thank you, Alex. So my part of this webinar is just to provide an overview of who the stakeholder group are, how the group was brought together, and what activities we've undertaken. At the end of this short bit of the webinar, we've got some fabulous video vignettes where the stakeholders give their own perspective. But for now, just introducing you to who the group are. So we wanted a stakeholder group of up to 15 people from a variety of backgrounds, ages, different geographical locations, but UK based, different experiences of stroke, whether they'd personally had a stroke or they were a relative or a carer for somebody who was living with stroke, or whether they were a healthcare professional working in the health system or in education or research. So our initial stakeholder group consisted of 4 people who were living with stroke, 4 people who were carers or relatives of somebody living with stroke, and 7 physiotherapists. We have unfortunately had just a couple of dropouts, but we've still got an active and sizable stakeholder group. So how did we get the group together? So we publicised that the Cochrane review was being updated and that we were looking for a stakeholder group. And we publicised through a variety of forums such as the Stroke Association, Chest, Heart and Stroke Scotland, ACPIN, which is the Association of Chartered Physiotherapists who are interested in neurology. We used Twitter and cascaded the information that we were recruiting through Twitter as well. And it wasn't important that members of the stakeholder group had experience of stroke research or that they'd had experience of Cochrane reviews. We wanted people who were interested in how they could contribute to and shape the review. And we also wanted people who were confident to contribute to discussions, contribute their views within a small online group. So the response to the initial adverts was good, and we asked potential stakeholder members to provide a brief expression of interest that covered their experience, their motivations for being involved in the review, and other background information that would help us to select different people with different experiences. So we asked for their age bracket, for example. We didn't want all young people or all older people. We asked about geographical location, and we asked physiotherapists to tell us their area of work, whether they were in acute stroke, whether they were in an urban area or a rural area, whether they were in a community setting or private practice. We ended up with just under 40 expressions of interest and ultimately developed the initial stakeholder group of 15 people. Next slide. Okay, so we have got 4 planned stakeholder meetings, and 2 of these have already taken place. So our first meeting was in November 2021, and our second meeting was in January this year, and we've got another 2 meetings planned in June and 1 in September. So we asked stakeholders to undertake a number of activities in preparation for the meeting. So we asked them to think about things We provided some short supporting documents and asked people to think about, well, what happens during physiotherapy for balance rehabilitation after stroke, or for people who've got standing problems or walking problems after a stroke. So there was some preparation to do before the first meeting. We also asked people to think about what does physical rehabilitation approach, what does the term physical rehabilitation approach mean to you? And again, we provided a document to stimulate some thoughts and some discussions. We provided a summary version of the last 2013 Cochrane Review. And associated with that, there was a podcast that Alex had done. So we provided a link to that podcast. We also provided sort of a little bit of tech support. So for people that wanted to, we undertook some practice Teams, MS Teams meetings. We did have some feedback that some of the material was difficult to engage with, particularly for the non-therapist members of the stakeholder group. So after the first meeting, in preparation for the second meeting, we prepared some narrated PowerPoints to introduce some of the more complex topics, but also to give people a chance to listen to and think about the material before coming to the meeting. So giving people a chance to formulate their thoughts or to think about questions that they wanted to ask or discussion points they wanted to make sure were covered. But if I go back to the first meeting and meeting rules, we can have the next slide. Thank you. So you've already met Richard, and we're extremely lucky to have Richard as part of the team. His expertise in public engagement is fantastic, and he facilitated the initial discussions and agreement of meeting rules that we were going to follow, and those were developed by the stakeholder group at the start of meeting one. And you can see them here. I'm not going to read them all out. You know, some important things about meetings where confidentiality, what's said in the room stays in the room, was useful just to ensure that that was stated and to let everyone have their say and to respect people whilst they were talking, or to allow people just to be quiet and absorb information and to reflect on discussions during the meetings. The rules that we have facilitated the smooth running of both meetings to date, and we received some nice positive feedback after the first meeting. Those are in the grey bubble, speech bubble on the top right of this slide. And it was good to see that stakeholders felt there was a good mix of people and that they could express their views, and that they were listened to. There were some challenges identified as well. Some of the challenges, some of the participants were that Teams was not so easy to use as Zoom, but we had to use Teams because people in the NHS who were joining during work time weren't able to use Zoom. There was some feedback that too much technical language was inaccessible. So that's a learning point for all of us, to use more lay language and to avoid using lots of abbreviations and acronyms, which as physiotherapists, we're quite good at doing that. As part of the support for stakeholders, Alex and the IT support team at Glasgow Cali University also put together a troubleshooting guide for using MS Teams, which has been quite useful. It's been useful for me as well, just learning a bit more about using Teams. If we can have the next slide, please. So I've just put up the agendas for the 2 meetings that we've had to date. And you can see that there's a variety of topics and activities. And I think maybe, as I've said before, we've asked stakeholders to undertake some tasks before meetings. And we sent the slides of the meetings that were going to happen to stakeholders in advance of meetings so they could see the format of what was going to be covered. Some of the key discussions in meeting 1 are in the lighter blue boxes. So we wanted stakeholders to think about what happens during physiotherapy from their professional or their personal perspective, and also what we meant by physical rehabilitation approaches. And these discussions and feedback that we had informed the proposal of a new model, which Alex is going to present to you later. So from the 2013 review, as Alex said, we had identified 27 treatment components, but following meetings 1 and 2, the new model has got a considerably greater number of components that have been identified by the stakeholders as being important for us to consider in our review of real-world physiotherapy for stroke rehabilitation. Next slide, please. So, working together with stakeholders, it's really important. It was really important to us to ensure that the stakeholders' voice was heard. So we had multiple means of doing this. I've already highlighted some of the preparatory activities that we asked people to undertake. But within the meetings, we undertook presentations to stimulate or to present ideas and present existing knowledge, but also to stimulate discussion. And so there was a number of questions within the presentations. We had some voting activities, both live voting, but we also gave participants the opportunity to go away and think about what we had discussed and to vote at a later date, to email their decisions to Alex or Julie, I can't remember. We did have to make some decisions, and we agreed as a stakeholder group that in order to agree on something, there had to be 75% consensus, which was good. So that means 3/4 of people are in agreement. And we asked for feedback on a number of topics after people had had a chance to reflect. So there was considerable discussion about the delivery of physiotherapy and the components that make up physio. And as I said, the group discussed the 27 components from the previous review, which were initially thought to be comprehensive at the time. And we had a number of quite lively discussions and identified that there were additional topics or components that were felt to be needed to be integrated into an updated model. So these were discussed and agreed, and the team, well, actually Alex, went away and drew up a revised model, which Alex is going to present to you in a minute. But before we move on to that new model, we thought it would be useful to introduce some of the stakeholders and their reflections on the process to date. So we're going to share some video vignettes, and these were created by Julie and Richard. And I hope that they provide some good insight into the stakeholder perceptions. So we'll just load up the video now.
Hi, my name's Sheila Cameron and I'm my dad's carer. I was interested in being involved to help me learn more actually about other physical rehabilitation treatments that he doesn't get, and to also share our experience of the treatments that he received.
Hi there, my name's Audrey Taggart and I had a hemorrhagic stroke in December 2014. And although 7 years ago seems a long time, it's still very fresh in my mind. So I was really quite pleased to be asked to be involved in this review, because having care from some physiotherapists, well, actually early on in my stroke and for a few years later, I got a lot of care from them, and I just wanted to do something to pay back and hope maybe that the experience that I had gained through that care, both negative and positive, would help perhaps influence the work of Spruce.
So my name's Rhiannon. So I'm a physiotherapist. I'm working in acute stroke, so an acute stroke unit. I am part of the Spruce stakeholder group. So I joined this group. It felt like it was something I hadn't really seen before, obviously something quite new. And I thought it was quite a good opportunity to gain a bit of insight into the process of developing a Cochrane review. Yeah, I was just really interested in looking to sort of those different areas of stroke rehabilitation, and sort of giving my own clinical experiences to that as well. And I think it seemed like an opportunity to also input around sort of areas within stroke rehabilitation that I've had interest in, and have been sort of trying to find areas of research and things around that as well. So yeah, sort of having some questions around sort of what evidence bases are available and that sort of thing. So I think that's where I sort of became interested in being involved.
Hi, I'm Carol. I'm very pleased to be with you today because this project to me is quite important and close to my heart, and I really feel it's been going on so well and it's been so well managed.
So what's involved is, so we've had the meetings, so giving a little bit of our own insights into stroke rehabilitation. So from my side, it's sort of been from more of the clinical side, and there's also been other people involved in giving information around sort of stroke survivors or carers as well, so different points of view to what stroke rehabilitation is, and then also sort of really reflecting on what's happened before, so sort of models that have been given for Cochrane reviews in the past, and then actually sort of picking that apart a little bit and giving our own inputs into what we actually feel physiotherapy is and the input that it has on that rehabilitation journey, and then reflecting on that and discussing it among the group as well, what we feel are the main points and the main inputs of physiotherapy.
It was exciting, it was interesting, and it gave you an insight into what kind of work went on in the background for stroke survivors. It was actually good to see that there was more than physical rehab looked at. They looked at input from carers and emotional aspects. So that really surprised me, but it delighted me as well.
We really have a voice. Everybody is heard. We're all equal. We all have the same weight. We vote on important decisions. We are able to be listened to, and we're fully involved and fully part of it. It is a real co-production.
Well, hopefully, once the review is complete and the model's up and running, it will be a model that will be an active model and not one that's put on a shelf for folk not to use, because it'll include most of the things that people will be wanting to review. So I do think it will be a lot better because it is a 21st century review and an updated 2020s review.
Physiotherapy, it is such a huge, broad subject, and we cover so much. And I think to have sort of an evidence base behind a lot of the things that we do, and just to help us direct a little bit for each patient, will be really, really helpful. But I think there's also that sort of using it as kind of a broad spectrum so that you can pick things out for each individual patient as well. And I think for me, that's going to be, yeah, really, really helpful.